It started as a family vacation, a once-in-a-lifetime cruise through the Caribbean. Amy Lynn Bradley was 24, bright, athletic, and ready to start a new job when her parents surprised her with the trip. 2 days later, she was gone. Early that morning, her father saw her asleep on the balcony. Minutes later, she wasn't there. No sound, no sign of a struggle. The ship kept sailing as if nothing had happened. When the crew finally made an announcement hours later, Amy had already vanished into the open sea. Rumors spread fast. A woman matching her description seen on shore, a musician who'd danced with her the night before refusing to answer questions, and a cruise line that wanted the story buried before the headlines caught up. In the next section, we'll retrace those final hours on board, the footage, the witnesses, and the moment everything went silent. Stay tuned, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what do you think really happened to Amy Bradley? Amy Lynn Bradley was 24 years old, from Petersburg, Virginia, smart, athletic, and ready to start a new chapter in life. She'd just finished school, lined up a job, and wanted one last adventure before diving into work. Friends said she was fearless in the water, the kind of person who thrived on challenges but stayed grounded. She wasn't naive, just confident, the kind who believed she could handle anything that came her way. Her parents, Ron and Iva, had been talking for years about taking a family vacation. They finally decided to do it. 1 week together on the Rhapsody of the Seas, a Royal Caribbean cruise through the Caribbean islands. It would be their first trip as a complete family in years. Her younger brother Brad brought his camcorder, recording everything. Their laughter, the music, the ocean stretched endlessly behind them. The Bradleys were a close, middle-class American family, ordinary, loving, and practical. Ron worked long hours, Iva kept their home steady, Brad was the funny one who made everyone laugh. And Amy, she was the spark. She loved loud music, pool decks, and sunrise coffee. She wasn't the type to sit quietly on a trip. She wanted to explore every corner of that ship. The first few days were perfect. They ate breakfast on the deck, took family photos, and joined in the onboard events. Passengers remember her as warm, outgoing, always smiling. One woman later told investigators, "You noticed her. She had energy." Amy spent hours sunbathing near the pool, talking with other travelers, and joking with the band that played each night in the lounge. There was one musician she clicked with, a man known by his stage name, Yellow. He played guitar for the ship's band and often stopped by to chat. Witnesses would later remember seeing them laughing together near the bar, dancing under the colored lights, and sharing drinks late into the night. At the time, it all looked normal, just a young woman enjoying her vacation. Ron, however, worried. He wasn't the type to hide his concern. At one point, he reminded Amy not to stay out too late or talk to too many strangers. She laughed it off. "I'm fine, Dad. Nothing's going to happen on a cruise ship." Those words would echo for decades. By the third night, the ship had settled into routine. The ocean was calm. The ocean was calm. The passengers slept or lingered in the bars and casinos. Somewhere between the music and the early hours of morning, Amy and her brother Brad talked out on the balcony of their cabin. He would later say she seemed relaxed, maybe tired but content. Around 5:30 a.m., their father woke up and saw Amy lying on a lounge chair outside, half asleep, looking peaceful. He went back to bed. When he got up again just a short while later, the chair was empty. Amy was gone. No sound, no splash, no sign of struggle. Her shoes were still in the room. Her cigarettes. Her ID. Everything she would have taken with her. The family began searching the decks, knocking on doors, asking anyone if they had seen her. A crew member suggested maybe she had gone to get coffee, but she hadn't taken her card or any money. Ron knew something was wrong immediately. He pushed for the ship to be stopped, for a full search to begin, but protocol slowed everything down. Hours passed before an official announcement was made. Paging Miss Bradley. Please contact guest services. The call echoed through the ship, unanswered. By then, the Rhapsody of the Seas was still sailing forward. The family searched on their own, hallways, stairwells, lounges, every place she might have gone. Other passengers joined in, but no one had seen her since dawn. At breakfast, a few guests said they noticed her talking to the band the night before, maybe heading toward the elevator after the show ended. One said she thought Amy had gone back to her room. Another said she'd seen a young woman by the railing around sunrise, but she couldn't be sure. The details blurred. Within hours, rumors began to spread quietly through the ship. Some whispered that she had fallen. Others said she must have jumped. But her family refused to accept either. Ron kept repeating, "She didn't fall. She wouldn't." The crew delayed notifying authorities until the ship reached its next port in Curaçao. By then it was too late for an immediate sea search. The Caribbean waters stretched endlessly, clear, blue, and empty. Helicopters scanned the surface. Boats circled the area. Nothing. No debris, no life ring, no trace of a body. The cruise line issued a short statement calling it a missing passenger situation. To the Bradleys, it was unthinkable. A daughter who vanished in plain sight, surrounded by people, cameras, and staff. In the days that followed, investigators interviewed passengers and crew. Some remembered her bright green eyes, her tattoo of a sun on her shoulder, the anklet she always wore. A few claimed they saw her on the pool deck early that morning. Others swore they didn't see her at all. The information contradicted itself at every turn. When the ship completed its route, the family stayed behind, desperate for answers. Posters went up in the ports, offering rewards, describing Amy as missing but believed alive. Local police searched beaches and nearby areas, but there was nothing. The vacation that was supposed to bring the Bradleys together ended in silence. A silence that stretched far beyond that ship, far beyond the Caribbean. Amy Lynn Bradley had simply vanished from a cruise that never stopped moving. And as the family packed their bags and faced the empty cabin one last time, a question settled over them and would haunt them for the next 20 years. How does someone disappear without a sound from the middle of the sea? In the next section, we'll go back to that final night aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas, the moments before dawn, the music, the witnesses, and the last known trace of Amy Bradley. The Rhapsody of the Seas glided smoothly across the Caribbean, sunlight flashing off its white decks. For the Bradley family, it was a long-delayed vacation, their first in years. Ron and Iva relaxed for the first time in months, and their 2 adult children, Amy and Brad, spent most of their time exploring the ship. Amy laughed easily, spoke with other passengers, and seemed completely at home. Brad filmed short clips on his camcorder, his sister leaning against the railing, hair caught in the wind, teasing their father about taking too many safety photos. It was a picture of normalcy, a happy family cruise, nothing more. That night, the ship's lounge filled with noise and colored lights. Amy and Brad watched a local band hired for the trip, a Caribbean dance group led by guitarist Alistair "Yellow" Douglas. He was friendly, confident, used to attention. Amy danced with him a few times, shared a drink, and talked with the other musicians after their set. Several passengers remembered the scene later. One woman said, "They were just having fun, nothing odd." Around 1 a.m., the lounge emptied, and Amy was last seen heading toward the elevators with Brad. The mood was still light, just another night at sea. But not everyone that night looked relaxed. A few witnesses later described a man standing near the dance floor, watching Amy for a long time without speaking. A bartender recalled a strange feeling, like someone was following her with their eyes. No one could identify who he was, and the ship's cameras didn't capture a clear image. The atmosphere, festive only an hour before, began to feel tense in hindsight. At the time, though, nothing stood out enough to cause alarm. Close to dawn, Amy returned to the family's cabin. Brad was awake, scrolling through photos. They talked quietly out on the balcony, about home, work, and how she'd miss the ocean when they returned to Virginia. Brad would later tell investigators that she seemed fine, alert, relaxed, not drunk or upset. Around 5:15 a.m., their father woke briefly and saw her stretched out on a lounge chair outside, eyes closed, half asleep. He went back to bed. When he woke again less than an hour later, the chair was empty. The balcony door was still open. The sea looked calm. Inside the cabin, everything of hers remained untouched. Shoes by the bed, ID card on the table, cigarettes near the door. No sign of struggle or noise. Ron thought she'd gone for coffee. The cafe opened early, and she liked quiet mornings. A crew member gave the same suggestion. She probably went for coffee, and told him not to worry. But when the family checked the cafe, she wasn't there. She wasn't on the pool deck, the upper level, or anywhere near the dining hall. Ron's calm slipped into panic. He ran through hallways, knocking on cabin doors, calling her name. Iva reported her missing to the front desk, demanding an announcement. The staff hesitated, explaining there were procedures to follow. Hours passed before any public notice was made. Finally, over the ship's speakers came a flat voice. "Paging Miss Bradley. Please contact guest services." Silence. By then, Amy had been missing for nearly 4 hours. Witness accounts trickled in, none of them consistent. One passenger claimed to have seen Amy around 6:30 a.m. near the cafe. Another swore she'd spotted her with Douglas on the upper deck. No footage supported either story. When questioned, Douglas said simply, "I was just being nice. She was fine when I saw her." His tone, according to one investigator, was calm, maybe too calm. The Bradleys pleaded with the captain to stop the ship and begin a search. He refused, citing maritime regulations and schedules. The Rhapsody of the Seas continued its route toward Curaçao, while the family walked deck after deck, asking strangers for help. Passengers joined in quietly, scanning corridors, peering into lounges. Nothing. Not one trace of her. By the time the vessel reached port, any possible evidence had long drifted away with the current. When local authorities boarded, they treated it as a routine case, a missing passenger presumed lost at sea. Helicopters searched the surrounding water, rescue boats scanned the surface, but no one expected results. The Caribbean that morning looked endless, bright and empty. Ron and Iva sat side by side near the railing as the crew prepared for the next group of tourists. The ship's music played faintly somewhere below. Ron stared at the horizon and said quietly, "She didn't fall. She was taken." It wasn't anger in his voice, just certainty. Behind them, passengers carried suitcases and cameras, already thinking of home. Around them, everything looked ordinary again. Sunlight, laughter, the next vacation beginning exactly where theirs had ended. By the time the official search began, Amy Bradley had already vanished, and the ocean had erased the first traces of the truth. Morning broke over the Caribbean, but on the Rhapsody of the seas, the day began with panic. When Ron Bradley woke and saw his daughter's empty chair on the balcony, he thought she'd gone for coffee. 10 minutes passed, then 20. He checked the bathroom, the hallway, and the cafe on deck 9. No one had seen her. Within minutes, the calm of the cruise vanished. He started running through corridors, knocking on doors, calling her name. Iva hurried to the front desk, demanding help. The clerk smiled politely, saying it was probably nothing. Maybe she went to breakfast. But Ron's voice broke through the noise. "My daughter is missing." The captain was informed, but his reaction was slow. Maritime procedure required verification before any public announcement. Instead of halting the ship, he instructed staff to check internally. For the next 3 hours, while passengers sunbathed and lined up for the breakfast buffet, the Bradleys searched the ship on their own. It wasn't until around 8 a.m., more than 3 hours after she was last seen, that a voice came over the intercom. "Paging Miss Bradley. Please contact guest services." The announcement echoed down the hallways, but no one responded. The Bradleys begged the captain to stop the ship. "She could be in the water," Ron pleaded. "Every second counts." But the captain refused. "We must follow maritime procedure." The Rhapsody kept moving toward Curaçao, covering miles of open sea that might have been a search zone. Passengers kept eating breakfast, drinking coffee, snapping photos, unaware that a young woman had vanished from the same deck only hours earlier. Ron stood alone at the railing, staring at the ocean. "Every second counts," he said, "and we're wasting them." When the ship's security team began to question witnesses, the accounts were scattered and contradictory. A cabin attendant said she saw Amy around 6 a.m. near the cafe. Another passenger claimed she'd been on the upper deck, near the pool. Someone else thought she might have gone for a morning workout. No two stories matched, and none could be confirmed. The ship's security footage offered no help. Amy appeared on camera the previous night, leaving the lounge around 1 a.m. with her brother. After that, the trail ended. There was nothing after 5:30 a.m., not even a shadow. Attention turned quickly to the ship's band, the Blue Orchid. Amy had spent time with their guitarist, Alistair "Yellow" Douglas, the night before. He was called in for questioning. His tone was calm, even detached. "She left after we talked," he said. "I don't know where she went." Another band member later told investigators that Douglas had been nervous that morning, repeatedly asking if the police had searched any cabins. Still, without proof, he was released. The family's suspicions grew, but they had no authority, no access, and no support. With no official search underway, Ron and Brad began combing the ship deck by deck. The pool area, the staff hallways, even restricted zones. Iva printed out a photo from her camera and pinned it on a notice board with the words, "Missing, Amy Lynn Bradley." A few passengers offered to help, but security stopped them. "Please don't disturb other guests," they were told. Soon, whispers began spreading across the decks. "She probably jumped. Maybe she fell." The Bradleys pushed back on every rumor. "She wouldn't," Ron said firmly. "She's a swimmer. She wouldn't fall." By noon, the ship approached Curaçao, its scheduled destination. Only then did the captain radio local authorities and the U.S. Coast Guard. Helicopters and patrol boats were deployed to search the area where the ship had sailed that morning. But by then, the Rhapsody had traveled dozens of miles. Whatever clues existed had long disappeared into the current. The search lasted several hours. Crews scanned the water for debris, life rings, or signs of distress. They found nothing. No clothing, no floating objects, no trace of a struggle. The sea was calm, still, and silent. In his daily logbook, the captain wrote a single line. Passenger Amy Lynn Bradley, missing, presumed overboard. As the story spread across the ship, Royal Caribbean's corporate team moved quickly. Legal representatives flew to Curaçao to manage the situation. A public statement was issued. We have followed all safety protocols. The company is fully cooperating with authorities. Privately, the Bradleys were denied access to the full security footage. They were allowed to see only fragments. A few seconds of Amy dancing, laughing, then walking down a hallway. Nothing of value, nothing new. Iva later said it felt like they were hiding something. As the day wore on, the cruise continued as planned. New passengers boarded, entertainment resumed, and the Bradleys stayed behind, waiting by the port as helicopters returned empty. The official search ended that evening with no progress. After 14 hours, rescue operations were suspended. The sea turned dark under the fading light, the ship's reflection rippling on the water. Ron and Iva sat together on the pier, silent. Ron finally said what both had been thinking all day. She didn't fall. She was taken. It was no longer panic. It was conviction. By nightfall, the paperwork was complete. The official conclusion read simply, passenger presumed missing at sea. The cruise line's statement was brief and procedural. The family packed their suitcases in silence. Around them, the port of Curaçao glowed with warm lights and music. A cruel reminder that, for everyone else, the voyage had ended normally. But for the Bradleys, the cruise was over in another way entirely. Their daughter had vanished, their questions ignored, and their faith in the system already broken. By the time they stepped off the Rhapsody of the Seas, Amy Lynn Bradley was gone, and the ocean had already erased the first clues of what really happened that morning. When the Rhapsody of the Seas finally docked in Curaçao, the story had already started to spread. A young American woman had vanished somewhere between open sea and shore. Reporters were waiting by the pier, passengers whispered, and the Bradleys, exhausted and terrified, refused to leave. They stayed behind while the rest of the tourists disembarked for sightseeing. Ron and Iva printed photos of Amy at a local shop and carried them through cafes, docks, and police stations. Her face was taped to poles, pinned to notice boards, and passed from hand to hand. But every officer they met gave the same answer. Wait a few days. People get lost. They turn up. Ron didn't believe it. Amy didn't fall, he told one officer. She's somewhere here. That same afternoon, the first possible lead surfaced. A local taxi driver came forward saying that early that morning, just hours after the Rhapsody docked, he'd seen a young woman who looked like Amy. She appeared frightened, trying to use a payphone before two men approached and pulled her away. He remembered her wearing a white shirt and khaki shorts. the same outfit Amy was last seen in. The Bradleys rushed to the location he described. The street was crowded with vendors, tourists, and taxi stands. There were no cameras, no stores that kept surveillance tapes. Police took the man's statement but refused to classify it as an active lead. "Without evidence, we can't open an investigation," the officer said flatly. Days later, new whispers spread through Willemstad, the capital. People claimed to have seen a woman with a dolphin tattoo just like Amy's at a bar near the beach. The bartender remembered her clearly. She looked nervous, didn't talk much, left with 2 men. Local police checked the bar, but there was nothing. No registration, no credit card charge, no footage. Still, the Bradleys clung to the possibility. They offered a $200,000 reward for information. Flyers with Amy's photo covered every corner of downtown Willemstad. A local headline read, "Missing American Woman Possibly Seen Alive." For the first time since that morning on the ship, hope returned. A week later, a Canadian couple vacationing on the island came forward with another story. They told authorities that while walking on a secluded beach, they had seen a young woman between 2 men. "She looked terrified," the woman recalled. "When she turned toward me, she mouthed something, maybe, 'Help me.'" When they looked back moments later, the trio had vanished into a nearby parking lot. The couple described the scene in detail, even drawing a map. The police recorded their statement, thanked them, and closed the file. There were no follow-ups. But when the couple returned to Canada, they called the Bradleys directly after seeing Amy's face on the news. Their story reached American television. Within days, the Today Show, CNN, and America's Most Wanted began covering the case. The Bradleys' hotel phone rang constantly. Some callers swore they saw Amy in bars or on the beach. Others claimed she'd been kidnapped. A few were cruel hoaxes. Amid the noise, one truth became clear. Amy's disappearance had become a public mystery, but not yet a priority. Ron and Iva demanded access to all ship records. They asked Royal Caribbean to hand over security footage, staff logs, and the full list of passengers who disembarked in Curaçao. The company responded with a single statement: "We are fully cooperating with authorities." But when Ron checked with Curaçao police, they admitted they'd only received partial information. Key surveillance tapes were missing. Crew schedules were under review. And when Ron asked about Alistair Douglas, the musician who'd last been seen with Amy, he was told that Douglas had already flown back to the United States. "Why would they let him leave?" Ron asked. "He's a contractor," came the reply. "Not under investigation." That was the moment the family realized how little power they had. As media attention grew, Royal Caribbean began to distance itself from the story. Their public statement emphasized safety records and protocol. "We have followed all procedures," a spokesperson told reporters. "There is no evidence of foul play." Back on the island, the Bradleys were running out of options. They hired local guides, combed through tourist areas, and visited police stations daily. Amy's photo was everywhere, in shop windows, on lampposts, even at the airport. Tourists stopped to stare. Some whispered, most walked on. Then came a flood of false hope. Hundreds of calls reached the family hotline after the America's Most Wanted segment aired. People said they'd seen her in Aruba, Trinidad, even in Florida. Each tip was logged, checked, and eventually dismissed. Still, the family chased every one of them. After 2 exhausting weeks, the Bradleys held a small press conference in Willemstad. Ron stood before a handful of reporters and said, "If anyone out there saw something, please come forward. We're not leaving until we know what happened." His voice was steady, but the fatigue showed. No one came forward. That night, as helicopters circled the coastline for one last sweep, the family stood on the sand watching the beams of light move across the water. Iva said softly, She's out there. I know she is. Ron didn't answer. The next morning, the search was officially suspended. The Curaçao police declared the case inactive due to lack of evidence. Royal Caribbean resumed its next cruise schedule. New passengers boarded the same ship in the same port, as if nothing had ever happened. The Bradleys packed their suitcases in silence. They had a stack of police reports, handwritten witness notes, and a folder filled with unverified sightings. Before boarding their flight home, Brad said, "We'll find her, even if it takes years." As the plane lifted from Curaçao, the island shrank below them, the beaches, the bars, the harbor where everything had gone wrong. For a brief moment, the world had cared. Cameras had turned toward them. Headlines had flashed her name. But as quickly as the story spread, it faded. And while the news cycle moved on, the Bradleys did not. They carried home the only thing they had left: questions. In the years that followed, those questions would harden into obsession, and silence would become the only answer they ever received. Months passed after the search in Curaçao ended, and nothing new appeared. The case was quietly closed as unsolved, presumed lost at sea. The Bradleys returned home to Virginia with boxes of papers, maps, and unanswered questions. Their house slowly became a command post, walls covered with timelines, pins, and newspaper clippings from across the Caribbean. The first year ended with silence. Local police had no leads. The U.S. consulate filed its final report. No credible sightings. News outlets moved on. Amy's name faded from headlines, mentioned only in small anniversary blurbs under "Family Still Searching for Missing Daughter." Ron refused to accept the silence. He spent his nights cataloging every witness statement, drawing lines between ports, ships, and dates. He believed the answer wasn't lost. It was buried. But as time went on, desperation attracted deception. A private investigator from Florida reached out, claiming connections to international trafficking networks. He promised to track Amy's trail for a modest retainer. The Bradleys wired several $1,000s. Weeks later, he disappeared. Phone disconnected, email deleted. Then came another message, an anonymous email. "I know where she is. Send $10,000. They sent nothing. They'd already learned that every glimmer of hope came with a price. Ron began to distrust everyone, reporters, investigators, even law enforcement. He wrote later, "Every time the phone rang, I hoped it was her. Every time it wasn't." By the mid-2000s, the case was a cold headline, a tragedy lost at sea. But television kept it alive in fragments. Unsolved Mysteries, 2020, and later America's Most Wanted revisited the story, bringing a wave of public attention each time. Hundreds of calls followed every broadcast, each one claiming to know something. A waitress in Aruba said she'd seen Amy at a resort. A tourist in Puerto Rico swore she recognized her in a bar. A man from Mexico sent a letter describing a woman with green eyes and a gecko tattoo. Every tip was added to the Amy file, a collection that eventually filled an entire cabinet. None of it led anywhere. Then, in 2005, something different appeared. A photograph surfaced online. A blurry image of a woman sitting on a bed in a dark nightclub, wearing heavy makeup, her eyes hollow. She looked like Amy. The resemblance was uncanny. The jawline, the hair, even a faint shape near the shoulder where Amy's tattoo would have been. The photo spread across forums, tabloids, and eventually reached the FBI. Analysts reviewed it but could not confirm anything. "Image quality insufficient," the report read. Still, for the Bradleys, it was the first real flicker of life in years. They printed the photo, enlarged it, sent it to private facial recognition experts. Each one came back with the same answer: inconclusive. But it was enough to restart their belief. Eva said later, "If there's even 1% chance, we have to keep going." Then in 2007, another message arrived. Short, cold, and unsigned. "She's alive. Stop asking questions." The FBI traced the IP address to somewhere in Europe, but couldn't identify the sender. The email became an online mystery, circulating across crime boards and forums. Conspiracy theorists dissected every word, every timestamp. Some said it was a cruel prank. Others believed it came from someone inside a trafficking ring. The Bradleys received more letters after that, some offering information, others delivering threats. The line between truth and manipulation blurred completely. Ron wrote in his notes, "Every rumor gives us life, then takes it away." By then their son Brad had grown up. He was just a teenager when Amy vanished, but her absence defined his life. After joining the military, he learned investigation tactics, surveillance, and data analysis. When he returned home, he took over the search. Brad began building his own database, cross-referencing cruise ship records, ports of call, and active trafficking routes from the late 1990s. He believed his sister hadn't drowned. She'd been taken. He reached out to former FBI agents and journalists who had once covered the story. Some remembered. Most didn't. But a few still had notes, copies of reports, even photos that had never been released. Brad pieced everything together, creating what he called the map of what really happened. His findings pointed to a pattern. Multiple disappearances of young women from cruise ships operating in the same region between 1997 and 2002. Different ships, different victims, but similar circumstances. Last seen at night near crew areas, always written off as accidents. Brad started pushing the theory publicly, appearing in interviews, saying what others were afraid to. "These aren't accidents. This is organized." Then, more than a decade after Amy vanished, a new voice emerged, a survivor. In the early 2000s, authorities in Central America rescued several women from a trafficking network operating between Caribbean islands. Among them was a woman who told investigators about an American named Amy. She said Amy had told her she'd been taken from a cruise ship years earlier. When asked for details, the survivor couldn't recall the date or the exact location, only that Amy had a tattoo of a gecko and a sun on her shoulder. The description matched perfectly. The FBI verified the statement and deemed it credible. For the first time in over 10 years, the case file was reopened. A new task force was formed, a joint operation between the FBI and Interpol. They began reviewing every lead, every record from Curaçao, Aruba, and Venezuela. Ron and Eva were summoned to Washington, D.C. for a full debrief. They brought their 20 years of notes, binders, and boxes, evidence that had outlasted investigators, journalists, and entire agencies. Ron looked across the table at the agents and said quietly, "We did your job for 20 years. Now do it right." This time the response was different. The agents listened. They took notes. They promised action. After 2 decades of silence, Amy's case was officially reopened. And for the first time, hope didn't come from rumors. It came from evidence. For years, the Bradleys had lived between false leads and broken promises. But now, something real had surfaced. Something strong enough to move the case forward. The silence that had followed Amy's disappearance was finally starting to crack. And somewhere within that silence, the truth was waiting to be found. 2 decades after Amy Bradley vanished from a cruise ship, The silence finally began to break. The turning point came from a single witness, a woman rescued from a trafficking network in Central America. During her debriefing, she told investigators about an American named Amy. She said Amy claimed she'd been taken from a cruise ship years earlier. The woman remembered only fragments: a Caribbean island, a house with a blue gate, a tattoo of a gecko and a sun on the woman's shoulder. For the first time in 20 years, the FBI reopened the Bradley case. A special task force was formed in partnership with Interpol and Dutch Caribbean authorities. They compiled a list of known trafficking routes through Curaçao, Aruba, and Venezuela, cross-referencing old port logs and missing person reports from the late 1990s. One profile stood out: American female, mid-20s, taken from cruise vessel, tattoo on right shoulder. The match was unmistakable. Investigators began tracing the path described by the survivor. She led them to the outskirts of Willemstad, Curaçao, to a decaying villa that had once served as a transit point for human trafficking. The property was abandoned. Rusted gates, shattered glass, walls stained by years of salt air. In the basement, behind a section of loose masonry, agents discovered a small wooden box wrapped in cloth. Inside were a broken comb, 2 pieces of costume jewelry, and a silver bracelet engraved with one word: Bradley. The evidence was flown immediately to Quantico. Forensic technicians worked through the night. When the DNA results came back, the report was brief but definitive. Positive familial match, material likely belonging to Amy Lynn Bradley. It was the first physical proof of Amy's existence since 1998. In a private meeting room at the FBI field office in Washington, agents delivered the news to the Bradleys. Eva listened without moving. Her first words were quiet. "Is she alive?" The agent paused before answering. "We don't know. But she was there." The investigation widened quickly. As agents reviewed the original crew manifests, one name resurfaced: Alistair "Yellow" Douglas, the musician who had spent time with Amy the night she disappeared. Douglas was still living in Florida, still performing on small cruise lines. He agreed to an interview, insisting he'd done nothing wrong. At first, his story matched his testimony from 1998. "I saw her that morning. We talked, then she left. I never saw her again." But 3 hours into questioning, the tone shifted. When pressed about his movements during the early hours of that morning, he hesitated. "Maybe she left with someone," he said. "I don't really remember." Investigators compared his statement to the ship's security records. The logs showed a missing 30-minute window when Douglas wasn't in the performance area, contradicting his own timeline. It wasn't proof, but it was the first crack in his story. As the FBI traced back every surviving crew member, another lead surfaced. A former maintenance worker, now retired in Texas, had kept an old external hard drive from his time on the ship. Forensics recovered several deleted internal messages between security staff, dated the same morning Amy disappeared. One message read, "The girl is gone. Don't talk." Another said, "Keep it quiet. Legal team will handle." The timestamps matched the exact hours when Amy vanished. The sender's account was linked to the ship's security office. the same restricted area where Douglas was reportedly seen. Though circumstantial, the discovery painted a larger picture, one of silence, control, and possible corporate cover-up. Interpol analysts then cross-checked the FBI's data with their own archive of late 1990s trafficking cases in the Caribbean. The pattern was undeniable. Multiple women, mostly young, white, traveling alone or with families, had vanished from tourist zones or cruise routes, often written off as accidents or voluntary disappearances. Several of those ships belonged to the same cruise conglomerate. The Bradley case no longer looked isolated. It fit into a chain of organized trafficking operations, hidden behind the facade of luxury travel. The Justice Department prepared federal charges, kidnapping and human trafficking across international borders. Douglas was officially reclassified from witness to primary suspect. Federal agents secured a search warrant for his home in Fort Lauderdale. They seized laptops, handwritten notes, and multiple phones. Neighbors later recalled seeing agents carry out sealed boxes marked evidence. At the same time, search teams in Curaçao continued excavations around the villa and nearby coastal tunnels, hoping for additional forensic material. Several artifacts were collected, though none could be conclusively linked to Amy. News of the discovery broke nationwide. Headlines read, "Breakthrough in 2-decade-old cruise mystery." For the first time in years, Amy Bradley's name reappeared on front pages and evening broadcasts. Journalists revisited old interviews, replaying footage of her parents pleading for answers in 1998. In Virginia, the Bradleys received a formal invitation to Washington, D.C., for an in-person briefing. They arrived quietly. No cameras, no reporters, just the three of them. Inside a small conference room, agents laid out folders, photographs, and evidence bags. One of them spoke carefully. "We have what we need to move forward." Eva reached for Ron's hand. "It's been so long," she said. "I just want her to be found." Brad sat across the table, staring at the photograph of his sister pinned to the report cover. "We finally have proof," he said. "Now we need justice." The meeting ended with a silence that felt heavier than before, the kind that comes not from uncertainty, but from knowing that the fight was about to restart. As they left the building, reporters shouted questions from across the street, but the family said nothing. Their expressions carried something different this time. Not desperation, but focus. That night, the FBI task force assembled again, spreading out decades of files, maps, and digital evidence across a long table. The pieces were finally forming a picture. For 20 years, the truth had been buried beneath bureaucracy, indifference, and the myth of the missing at sea. Now, the walls were closing in. Every document, every message, every trace of the ship's history was being reconstructed. The sea that had hidden Amy's story for 2 decades was about to give it back. Because the silence had lasted long enough. And this time, justice was no longer a hope. It was an operation already in motion. When the DNA evidence confirmed that the silver bracelet belonged to Amy Bradley, it felt like the case had finally come alive again. But for the FBI, that moment of hope quickly collided with the same wall that had stopped justice for 20 years. Jurisdiction. Their first official request for cooperation was sent to the Curaçao police and the Dutch Maritime Authority. The reply came back within days. outside jurisdiction. Incident occurred in international waters. The original case file from 1998 contained only a single line. Passenger presumed missing at sea. Case closed. There were no forensic reports, no witness transcripts, no security logs from the ship. One FBI investigator later said, "We were chasing ghosts made of paperwork." It was as if the entire case had to be rebuilt from nothing. Royal Caribbean, the cruise company at the center of it all, issued a polished statement. "We are cooperating fully with authorities." But when the Bureau requested the ship's complete internal surveillance archives, only a fraction arrived. Roughly 12% of what should have existed. The rest, the company claimed, had been deleted under data retention policy. Their attorney told the press, "It's a tragedy, but our procedures were followed." Reporters started asking harder questions. If Amy's disappearance had been written off so quickly, how many other passengers had been lost in similar accidents? An anonymous former employee stepped forward with a statement that would later make headlines. They had a code for it, an overboard event. It meant don't investigate too hard. The FBI shifted strategy. If the sea had erased evidence, they would recreate it. Working with the Naval Forensic Institute, they reconstructed Amy's cabin using the ship's original blueprints. The 3D models simulated the balcony, wind patterns, and the ship's speed at the time. Tests revealed something crucial. The sliding balcony door couldn't be opened from the inside once locked. The physical design made it nearly impossible for someone to accidentally fall overboard. The forensic report concluded, "Evidence indicates balcony door was accessed externally." The trajectory analysis also ruled out a fall. Given the ship's course and wind direction that morning, no object dropped from the cabin could have vanished without leaving trace on deck or sea radar. The conclusion was simple but devastating. Amy didn't fall. Someone had entered her cabin and taken her. Weeks later, a retired Dutch police officer contacted the Bureau. He had worked on the 1998 inquiry and remembered a witness statement that never made it into the official file. From a warehouse in Rotterdam, he retrieved a handwritten note describing a sighting of Amy and Alistair Yellow Douglas near a restricted, crew-only area around 5:30 a.m. on the morning she disappeared. That note had been dismissed at the time for lack of corroboration. But when compared to Douglas's interrogation transcript, which showed a gap in his timeline during that exact hour, the puzzle finally started to fit together. Next came the data analysis. Interpol specialists recovered radar and GPS records from the Dutch Maritime Archives. On the morning of March 24, 1998, the Rhapsody of the Seas was located 16 nautical miles off Curaçao at 5:15 a.m. At 6:10, the ship adjusted course slightly south, toward a less monitored corridor of open water. By 6:30, the internal log recorded a maintenance lock on the lower crew deck, effectively sealing off a section of the ship from passenger access. FBI analysts noted the timing aligned perfectly with the suspected window when Amy vanished from her balcony. Interpol added another piece. The same maritime route had been linked to an organized trafficking network active between 1997 and 2000. Several women had disappeared under near-identical circumstances from cruise lines traveling through the Caribbean. The FBI's internal summary stated plainly, "Trajectory and timing consistent with organized abduction." When details of the reopened investigation leaked, the media storm was immediate. The New York Times headline read, "FBI believes Amy Bradley may have been taken. New evidence challenges cruise industry." Morning talk shows replayed footage of the Bradleys begging for answers decades earlier. The story gained momentum across every network. Royal Caribbean was summoned to a congressional hearing. Lawmakers demanded to know why surveillance data and safety records had vanished. Ron Bradley was invited to testify. His voice stayed steady, but his words cut through the silence. "We trusted them with our family. They trusted their lawyers more than our daughter." The pressure worked. The Department of Justice accelerated the case review, and within months, the Bureau finalized its 600-page investigation report. The official findings were clear. Amy Lynn Bradley had not fallen from the ship. She had been approached, coerced, and removed from her cabin. The act was part of a coordinated operation tied to human trafficking networks in the Caribbean. Royal Caribbean had violated maritime safety protocols and withheld evidence that could have changed the course of the investigation. The Justice Department approved a federal indictment under 3 charges: kidnapping, human trafficking, and obstruction of justice. With the indictment signed, agents moved to secure the suspect. In Florida, at 4 a.m., a team of FBI officers arrived at the Fort Lauderdale apartment of Alistair "Yellow" Douglas. He was taken into custody without resistance. Cameras captured him being led out in handcuffs, head down, wearing the same blank expression he'd worn in interviews 20 years earlier. At the press briefing later that morning, the Bureau's spokesperson addressed the crowd. "This case reminds us that justice delayed is not justice denied." The Bradley family was notified just hours before the announcement went public. Ron answered the call. When the agent confirmed the arrest, he said nothing, only handed the phone to Iva. She held a photograph of Amy in one hand, the receiver in the other, and whispered, "Now it begins." By evening, news outlets across America replayed the footage of Douglas's arrest alongside clips from 1998. The smiling family boarding a ship, unaware that their vacation would become a 20-year battle for truth. For the investigators, the breakthrough was more than an ending. It was proof that even against bureaucracy, distance, and time, persistence could still carve a path to justice. The final lines of the FBI report summed it up best. 2 decades of silence ended with evidence, not rumor. What began as a missing person case is now a federal crime, and for the first time, those responsible will have to answer for it. The wall had finally cracked, and behind it, the truth was waiting to be seen. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was surrounded by cameras, reporters, and a crowd that had waited more than 2 decades for an ending. The case was now titled United States versus Alistair Douglas. The headline on CNN read, "The Cruise Case That Wouldn't Die." Inside, the courtroom was silent. Alistair "Yellow" Douglas entered in a dark suit, hands clasped, face expressionless. His hair was gray now, his posture rigid. Across the aisle, Ron and Iva Bradley sat in the front row, holding hands. Behind them, Brad watched quietly. The same eyes that once searched shorelines, now fixed on the man who'd walked free for most of his life. The prosecutor opened with a single line that filled the air. "This case is about more than one woman lost at sea. It's about what happens when silence becomes policy." From there, the government built its case, brick by brick, fact by fact. The forensic team presented first. A photograph of a small silver bracelet appeared on the screen, the name Bradley still visible through the tarnish. The experts stated that DNA swabs taken from the inside of the clasp matched Amy's mother, Iva, with 100% certainty. The courtroom was still. Even Douglas turned slightly, staring at the image that had outlasted time and denial. Next came the cabin reconstruction. A digital 3D model showed how the balcony door could not be opened from the inside once locked. It wasn't an accident, the forensic expert said. It was entry. Douglas's attorney stood immediately. "That proves nothing about my client," he said. The prosecutor responded evenly. "Not alone. But combined with everything else, it proves intent." The next witness was a former crew member from the Rhapsody of the Seas. He was older now, with a careful voice. He testified that on the morning Amy disappeared, he received an internal message over the ship's security channel. "The girl is gone. Don't talk." The text logs were projected on screen, time-stamped 6:10 a.m. The prosecutor asked, "Who had access to that channel?" The witness answered, "The entertainment team and ship security." Douglas was part of that circle. As he stepped down, the FBI presented its technical evidence: GPS logs, camera access records, and the ship's sudden course change toward a less monitored corridor of the Caribbean. Each line of data aligned perfectly with the missing hour in Douglas's timeline. The patterns were no longer coincidence. The defense tried to push back. They painted Douglas as a scapegoat for an unsolved tragedy. "No body was ever found," his lawyer said firmly. "Without that, there is no murder, no crime." The prosecutor didn't hesitate. "This isn't a murder trial. It's kidnapping and trafficking, crimes that don't need a corpse to prove guilt." A ripple went through the courtroom. Douglas stared ahead, his expression flat, but the tension around him grew visible. His lawyer whispered something, but Douglas didn't reply. Then came the evidence that broke the silence of the room completely. The prosecutor held up a phone, retrieved years earlier from a former co-worker of Douglas. He played a short, low-quality recording captured from the early 2000s. A man's voice, calm, careless, said, "She's not coming back." The sound echoed against the wooden walls. No one moved. No one spoke. Ron closed his eyes. Iva's hand trembled slightly but didn't let go of his. Brad stared straight at Douglas. The prosecutor looked around the room. "This is the sound the Bradleys lived with for 20 years. One juror wiped a tear. Another lowered his head. The court was heavy with the weight of absence. Not just Amy's, but the years that had been stolen with her. When Brad was called to the stand, he didn't bring notes. He simply walked forward and faced the man accused of taking his sister. His voice was clear and controlled. "For 20 years, my parents woke up every day to your silence," he said. "Every birthday, every Christmas, we wondered if she was still alive. You didn't just take Amy. You took time. You took peace." His words hung in the air. No one spoke after him. Even Douglas, for the first time, shifted his gaze downward. The defense rested the next day. Their closing argument was short, almost resigned. The lawyer repeated the phrase reasonable doubt like a shield, but it sounded hollow in the quiet room. The prosecutor's closing was methodical, not dramatic. He walked the jury through the timeline. The bracelet, the cabin, the messages, the recording. This case began in open water, he said, where the line between tragedy and crime can be blurred. But the truth isn't lost at sea. It waits, and today it's here. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the third morning they returned. The foreman stood, voice steady. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Ron reached for Iva's hand. Neither of them cried. They simply exhaled, slow, almost fragile, as if their bodies had forgotten how to breathe without waiting for bad news. Douglas sat motionless, staring at the floor. The judge's voice was calm and deliberate as he read the sentence. Life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell silent again. This time it wasn't grief. It was finality. Outside, the world moved quickly. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions as the family emerged. One called out, "Do you feel justice was done?" Ron paused, looked toward the crowd and said, "Justice isn't about winning. It's about ending silence." Beside him, Iva clutched a framed photograph of Amy, the same one she'd shown reporters 20 years ago. She didn't look at the cameras. She just walked forward. Behind them, Brad placed a hand on his father's shoulder. Together they stepped down the courthouse steps under the white glare of afternoon light. The crowd parted, and for a moment the noise faded. Only the sound of their footsteps remained, steady, certain, unhurried. The case that had begun in the dark waters of the Caribbean had finally reached the light of a federal courtroom. Justice had come late, but it had come. Not as comfort, but as proof that truth, no matter how long it drifts, can still surface. A few months after the trial, headlines appeared across every major network. Royal Caribbean issues public apology in Amy Bradley case. The cruise line released a televised statement acknowledging failures in its reporting and evidence retention procedures. The CEO looked directly at the camera and said, "We failed to act when a family needed us most. For that, we are deeply sorry." The Bradley family didn't appear. They didn't hold a press conference or issue a response. Their silence wasn't resentment. It was exhaustion. After 20 years of searching, they had nothing left to prove. And yet, from that silence, something larger began to move. In early 2024, Congress passed the Cruise Passenger Safety Reform Act, a sweeping maritime reform that changed the rules for every cruise line operating in U.S. waters. The law required full-time surveillance on all passenger decks, mandatory reporting of disappearances within 2 hours, and the preservation of security data for at least 10 years. One senator held up Amy's photograph during the session and said, "This law exists because one family refused to stop asking questions." The vote was nearly unanimous. It wasn't about politics. It was about accountability. And for the first time, the name Amy Lynn Bradley wasn't spoken in past tense, but as a reason for progress. That same year, the family founded the Amy Bradley Foundation in their home state of Virginia. Its mission was simple, but personal: to help families of those who vanish at sea, emotionally, legally, and financially. Brad took charge of the operations, his voice calm but determined during the opening ceremony. "We spent 20 years searching for one person," he said. "Now we'll help others not to wait that long." Over time, the foundation became more than a memorial. It became a network. Volunteers printed posters, sent letters to maritime agencies, and guided families through investigations that might have otherwise been ignored. In every email, every call, every name they helped bring home, Amy's presence lingered. Not as a ghost, but as purpose. A year after the trial, the Bradleys hosted a memorial at Virginia Beach, the place where Amy used to swim before work on summer mornings. More than 200 people gathered as the sun went down, each holding a white candle that flickered in the ocean wind. Brad stood on a small wooden platform, his voice carrying through the sound of the waves. "She's not gone," he said. "She changed things. Because of her, ships are safer. Because of her, families will be heard." The crowd fell silent. It wasn't grief, it was reverence. Nearby, Iva knelt and placed a bouquet of lilies in the water. Ron stood behind her, watching the flowers drift out with the tide. For the first time in decades, his eyes didn't search the horizon. They simply rested on it. By the end of the week, national networks aired the ceremony. News anchors described it as a story that began in tragedy but ended in reform. Editorial headlines read, "New cruise safety law signed, inspired by Amy Bradley." From loss to legacy, the family that changed maritime law. True crime shows revisited the case, calling it one of the most impactful investigations of its time. On social media, tributes poured in. She was taken by the sea, but she brought change to the shore. The hashtags #AmyBradleyLaw and #JusticeForAmy trended for weeks, not as outrage, but as remembrance. That winter, Ron agreed to one final interview. He sat in a quiet studio, the framed photo of Amy beside him. The interviewer asked, "After everything, what does justice mean to you now?" He paused. His hands were folded, steady. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear. "Justice doesn't mean punishment. It means no one else disappears without a trace." The interviewer said nothing for several seconds. The silence carried more weight than any follow-up question could. When the program aired, that line became its closing quote, the sentence that redefined the entire story. As months passed, the family stepped out of the public eye. The foundation continued its work quietly. Cruise lines installed more cameras. Laws tightened. Families felt less alone. And somewhere between reform and remembrance, the story of Amy Bradley stopped being a case and became a lesson. In the final sequence of the documentary, the screen faded from black to the warm grain of old home video. Amy laughing by a backyard pool. Brad recording her as she splashed water at their father. The sound of wind, the shimmer of sunlight. A voice saying, "Smile, Ames." Amy turned toward the camera, grinning. The narrator's voice closed the film with the same line that began it. She was the kind of girl who never disappeared quietly. And she never will. The footage froze on her smile. Waves rolled gently in the background, the sound soft and endless. Then, against a black screen, the final dedication appeared. Dedicated to all who were never found, and to the ones who never stopped looking. For the Bradleys, justice had never meant revenge. It meant remembrance, And for the millions who saw Amy's story, it meant something even larger. A reminder that one family's persistence can rewrite the rules of an entire world. Stories like this remind us that truth doesn't disappear. People just stop looking. If you believe stories like Amy's deserve to be told, hit the like button, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Your comment might help keep another name from being forgotten.